I am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to Cozy Tales.
The vicar's parlour was in disarray within the hour. Word had flown through St. Mary Mead like a startled bird, quick and unstoppable, and by the time Inspector Crail from Melchester arrived, half the village had already formed opinions as solid as a gospel truth. Mrs. Bantry insisted it was a heart attack brought on by too much excitement and too little breakfast. Colonel Denham declared it murder outright. You mark my words, Crail, these things never happen without reason, always money or women. And Mrs. Price Finch, looking suitably tragic in her lace shawl, murmured that it must have been the letter. The inspector, who was a tall, square man with the weary patience of one long used to provincial hysteria, kept his pencil poised and his expression unreadable. You say the letter was found earlier today, opened and empty. Yes, Inspector, said Miss Marple softly, from her chair near the fire. Her knitting rested neatly on her lap, untouched since the fete. Mr. Pritchard found it behind the tea tent just before luncheon. It seemed quite old, yellowed about the edges. I believe Mrs. Chilcot had been near the churchyard shortly before then. Crail turned to her with polite disinterest, as most men in his position tended to do when addressed by an elderly spinster. And you observed this yourself, madam? Oh, yes, Miss Marple replied mildly. She returned with earth on her gloves. I remember thinking it unusual for a woman as particular as Mrs. Chilcot. She disliked gardening, you know. The inspector jotted something down, though his eyes were already elsewhere. Thank you, Miss Marple. Now, about the maid. She's the one who found the body, I understand. Yes, said Mrs. Bantry quickly. Poor Elsie was beside herself. Said she found her mistress lying near the lilac bushes by the sundial. Said she thought at first she'd fainted, but then saw the blood, supplied Colonel Denham, never one to avoid a dramatic detail. From a wound to the head, Crail. Looked like she'd been struck with something heavy. Garden ornament, perhaps. Those little stone rabbits, eh? Just the right size for a swing. Crail frowned, scribbling again. No sign of theft, you say? None at all, said Mrs. Bantry. Her pearls were still on, and her purse was in her pocket. Terribly odd. Miss Marple said nothing, though her gaze had turned inward again, her mind quietly following the delicate pattern of cause and consequence that others missed. A torn letter, opened and emptied. A widow's soil-stained gloves. A wound upon the head. She had seen before how the most violent acts were born, not of greed or passion, but of humiliation. And St. Mary Mead was full of old wounds carefully hidden beneath politeness. As the inspector made his notes and the household grew restless, Miss Marple rose. If I may, Inspector, she said gently. It might be sensible to speak with Mr. Pritchard again. He handles everyone's post, after all. And if Mrs. Chilcot received a letter she wished to hide, he would likely have known its origin. Crail looked faintly amused. We'll handle it, Miss Marple. Thank you. She smiled pleasantly, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Of course. One mustn't meddle. She reached for her knitting and began looping yarn again, the quiet rhythm of it filling the pause that followed. But the moment the inspector and his men left, Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. You are thinking something, Jane. I know that look. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that people rarely write letters titled, to be read only after my death unless they have something very specific to confess. Or accuse. Mrs. Bantry gasped. You think the letter was meant for someone here? Oh, I should think so, said Miss Marple. And whoever that person was, they saw to it that it was never read. The following morning dawned grey and heavy. The lilac bushes around the Chilcot garden were cordoned off, their sweet scent incongruous with the dark soil disturbed beneath them. The inspector's men combed through the widow's belongings, and the maid, still trembling, repeated her story again and again, that Mrs. Chilcot had seemed uneasy all day, that she had gone out just before supper, carrying her garden gloves and a small tin box from her writing desk. The box, of course, had not been found. By midday, half the village had gathered outside the post office, each person offering theories more confident than the last. "She was being blackmailed, I tell you," insisted Colonel Denham. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Price Finch. "It was the maid. They're always the ones in the end." "I shouldn't be surprised if it were that young Ellison boy," murmured another. "He's always hanging about where he shouldn't." Through it all, Miss Marple stood quietly at the counter, purchasing a single sheet of writing paper and a new packet of wool. Her eyes flicked once toward Mr. Pritchard, whose usually brisk manner seemed unusually strained. As she turned to leave, she said in that mild, conversational way that never failed to unsettle the guilty, "I do hope you'll let me know if anyone comes asking about missing correspondence, Mr. Pritchard. After all, a letter like that tends to have a rather determined reader." He looked up sharply, color rising in his cheeks. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Oh, I dare say you don't," she said kindly, and stepped out into the soft drizzle, her knitting bag tucked beneath her arm. She walked toward the churchyard, where the earth still showed faint marks of a woman's gloved hands. Something had been buried there before the fete. She was certain. Something that had since been taken. And Miss Marple, who had long since learned that the dead often leave their truths in the most domestic of places, knew precisely where she would look next, in the widow's own sitting room, where an empty picture frame hung slightly askew on the wall. The sitting room of Mrs. Chilcot's house still smelled faintly of lavender polish and burnt matches when Miss Marple called that afternoon under the most natural of pretenses, a visit of condolence. The maid, poor trembling Elsie, admitted her at once. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands, "I can't believe she's gone. She was so particular about everything, every cushion in its place, every curtain tied just so. I keep thinking I'll hear her bell ring for tea." Miss Marple offered a small, kind smile. "Grief has its habits, my dear. It visits in echoes. Would you mind if I sat for a moment? I find one sees a great deal about a person in their drawing room." Elsie, too dazed to question, nodded and slipped away to the kitchen, muttering something about boiling the kettle. Miss Marple, left alone, glanced quietly about her. The room was exactly as she remembered. Tasteful, immaculate, but curiously impersonal. Not a photograph of Mr. Chilcot in sight, though he had been dead 10 years. Instead, there were flowers under glass, porcelain dogs on the mantelpiece, and above them the very frame she had noticed before, slightly askew, the kind of detail that would irritate a woman like Mrs. Chilcot immensely. She rose and examined it. The frame contained an old watercolor of the vicarage garden, faded and unremarkable. Yet when she lifted it gently from the wall, she saw that the back panel had been tampered with. Tiny scratches along the nails, as though it had been pried open and resealed. Miss Marple's eyes softened, thoughtful. "Dear me," she murmured, "how very human to hide something behind a picture. Out of sight, yet always in plain view." Footsteps in the hall startled her, and she replaced the frame at once. Inspector Crail entered, his expression a mixture of irritation and mild surprise. "Miss Marple, I might have guessed. Paying a social call, are you?" "Indeed I am," she replied pleasantly. "One can hardly ignore tragedy in the parish." He frowned, notebook in hand. "If you're here to help, I'd appreciate facts, not sentiment. We've confirmed she was struck with a blunt instrument, possibly that stone hair from the sundial path. No fingerprints, nothing missing except perhaps that tin box the maid mentioned. We've found no trace of it." Miss Marple's fingers twitched slightly at the mention. "You'll forgive me, Inspector, but I wonder, has anyone asked what was in the box?" Crail sighed. "The maid says it contained letters, private ones. Burned most of them over the years, apparently. The widow had a habit of keeping correspondence she shouldn't." "How interesting. Miss Marple said softly, as though remarking on a change in the weather. People who keep letters usually do so because they can't bear to destroy proof of affection, or fear to destroy proof of guilt. Creel's brow furrowed. You think someone killed her over the letters? Oh, I shouldn't dream of thinking anything at all, said Miss Marple mildly. But I have observed that human beings rarely kill for what they possess. More often, they kill to prevent others from possessing it. The inspector gave a small grunt, uncertain whether to take her seriously, and turned to note something down. Before he could speak again, the door opened, and Mr. Pritchard stepped in hesitantly, hat in hand. He looked unusually pale. Inspector Creel, I came as soon as I could. There's something I thought you ought to see. He produced a small envelope from his coat pocket, creased and slightly damp. One of the post girls found it in the hedge behind the office. It's addressed to Mrs. Agatha Chilcott and dated nearly 20 years ago. Creel took it, frowning. The handwriting was spidery but elegant. Inside was a single folded sheet, browned with age. He unfolded it carefully, but before he could read aloud, Miss Marple's soft voice cut in. I think, Inspector, it would be kinder if you didn't. Letters of that age are often of a delicate nature. Creel ignored her and read the first few lines silently. His eyebrows rose, then drew together. Well, this complicates things. He turned the letter toward her. Miss Marple's gaze flicked over the signature. Yours always, Edward. Edward Chilcott? She asked quietly. Creel nodded. Seems the widow received this shortly before her husband died. Mentions meeting her by the sundial. Says she must destroy the letter and that no one must ever know what they discussed. Then she did not destroy it, Miss Marple said, her tone soft but firm. She kept it, and perhaps others. A sentimental woman, but not a foolish one. I rather think Mrs. Chilcott was guarding more than memories. The inspector looked doubtful. You're suggesting someone killed her over an affair 20 years past? Not precisely, Miss Marple murmured, glancing toward the crooked picture frame. But secrets never stay buried, Inspector. Not even the ones kept in lavender drawers. As they left the house, a light rain began to fall again, turning the air damp and metallic. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, her eyes straying toward the sundial half hidden in shadow. A single robin perched upon it, flicking its wings as though impatient. She thought of the widow's gloved hands, the missing box, the hidden frame, and the letter that had never been meant to surface. Each piece fit somewhere, though the full picture had not yet emerged. But it would. It always did. For in villages like St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew, murder never came from nowhere. It was the harvest of long-tended secrets. The rain had deepened by the next morning, soft and unrelenting, pooling in the garden paths and dripping from the lilac leaves that still trembled under the weight of yesterday's discovery. The village had taken on that hushed, uneasy quiet particular to places where something dreadful has happened, and no one quite dares to speak of it aloud. Curtains fluttered ever so slightly when Miss Marple walked past, though no one waved. They were all watching, of course. She made her way to the vicarage, where Inspector Creel had taken to using the vicar's study as a temporary headquarters. His boots were muddy, his manner brisk, and his patience, it seemed, already thinning. Miss Marple, he said as she entered, if you've come to offer more theories about human nature, I've a desk full of facts that need sorting. Oh, I do sympathize, Inspector, she said mildly, removing her gloves. Facts are rather like people, you know. They can look quite different depending on where you stand. Creel muttered something under his breath, but gestured toward the armchair. We've found the tin box, or what's left of it, in the churchyard, under the holly by the east wall. Empty. Someone buried it shallow and tried to disguise the soil with a few daffodils. Daffodils, Miss Marple repeated softly. How clever and how foolish. They bloom so briefly. She folded her hands in her lap. Who discovered it? The gravedigger this morning, Creel said. And before you ask, yes, we've checked everyone who attended the fete yesterday. Chilcott's maid swears her mistress went out before supper to fetch something she'd forgotten at the fete. She never said what. I think she was retrieving that box. Only to be followed, Miss Marple murmured. Or perhaps met. He eyed her keenly. You think someone was waiting for her? Miss Marple smiled faintly. It's a lonely sort of place, the churchyard, particularly in the evening. And people in villages don't meet there for friendly reasons, Inspector. They meet there for privacy. Before Crail could reply, a knock came at the door. It was Mr. Pritchard, the postmaster again, his umbrella dripping and his hat clutched nervously in both hands. His usual bluster was gone. His eyes darted about like a man half afraid of what he'd already said. Begging your pardon, Inspector, he began, but I thought I ought to tell you there was another letter. Not addressed, though. Found it in the outgoing mail this morning, no stamp. Looks the same paper. Same hand as the one you showed me yesterday. He held out a small sealed envelope. Crail took it immediately, glancing at the neat, slanted script. To the one who knows, he read aloud. His expression hardened. What in blazes does that mean? Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. It means, Inspector, that whoever wrote it wasn't addressing a stranger. Crail slit the envelope with his penknife and unfolded the sheet. The ink was fresh, the words written in a trembling but deliberate hand. If you've read this, then you've done what I feared you would. I should never have kept the truth, but I cannot face it now. Forgive me, or don't. The end will find us both soon enough. There was no signature, only a faint smudge at the corner, as though from a gloved thumb. Crail swore under his breath. This could have been written by anyone. You think it's connected to the murder? Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her gaze far away. It's curious, she said at last. People rarely write confessions unless they're quite certain someone will read them, and this writer, whoever they were, expected the reader to understand perfectly well what the truth meant. That suggests intimacy, history, guilt, perhaps. She rose, moving to the window where the rain traced slow, silvery lines across the glass. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone spoken to Mr. Ellison, the young man who was so attentive at the fete? Crail frowned. Peter Ellison, the solicitor's clerk? We've no reason. Oh, but you should, said Miss Marple gently. He's Mrs. Chilcott's godson, I believe. She paid his school fees for years. Quite devoted, they say. And devotion, especially of the youthful kind, can sour into resentment when one feels betrayed. Crail exhaled sharply, snatching his hat from the rack. Very well. Let's pay young Mr. Ellison a visit. It was a short walk to the Ellisons' cottage on the lane by the mill stream. Peter himself opened the door, his tie loose, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He invited them in with a politeness that sounded rehearsed. When the inspector asked about his godmother, Peter's expression faltered. I was fond of her, of course. She helped me when Father died. She could be difficult, but she meant well. Miss Marple watched him closely. You were at the fete, I think, near the tea tent just before the letter was found. He hesitated. Yes, I was looking for her. She'd said she needed to speak with me privately later that evening. I waited near the gate, but she never came. Then this dreadful business. His voice broke, but there was something in the performance of it that rang too perfect, too tidy. Miss Marple tilted her head. How strange that she asked to meet you at all, considering the rain. Perhaps she meant to return something to you, or perhaps she had discovered something you'd rather not have known. His hand tightened around the arm of the chair. You're suggesting Good heavens, Miss Marple, you can't think I had anything to do with her death. Oh no, not at all, she said gently. Only that guilt sometimes looks very like grief, and the two are easily confused. When they left the cottage, Crail muttered, You think he's lying? Not about everything, said Miss Marple. But his fear isn't of discovery, it's of exposure. Someone besides him knew what Mrs. Chilcot intended to reveal, and that someone has been very careful indeed. They reached the lane, the rain easing to a mist. Miss Marple paused, glancing back toward the church tower rising pale through the fog. "There's a pattern forming, Inspector. A letter 20 years old, another written yesterday, a missing box, a death by the sundial, all turning about one very old conversation between a husband and wife." Crail frowned. "You think Edward Chilcot's death wasn't natural?" Miss Marple gave a small, almost regretful smile. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I very much doubt it ever was." The afternoon light dimmed early, filtered through a quilt of mist that clung low over St. Mary Mead. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she could already sense the hum of speculation growing beyond her neat hedgerows. The village had that peculiar energy it always did after a scandal. Curiosity disguised as concern, sympathy laced with excitement. But she paid it no mind. Her thoughts were elsewhere, circling quietly around the words, "the truth," and "the end will find us both." She put the kettle on and settled by the window, knitting set aside, her mind replaying details like the pieces of an unfinished embroidery. Edward Chilcot's letter, the empty tin box, the hidden frame, and then young Peter Ellison. His fear had been too exact, his composure too fragile. But guilt, Miss Marple knew, was never a simple matter. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. When she opened it, Mrs. Bantry stood there, cheeks pink from the chill, a scarf wrapped hastily about her head. "Jane, my dear, I had to come at once. You'll never believe what I've just heard. The inspectors called for the doctor to examine old Mr. Pritchard. Collapsed at the post office, right in front of the parish clerk." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes sharpened slightly. "Collapsed, you say? How unfortunate." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice as though the ivy on the walls might be listening. "They say it was his heart, but between you and me, he looked white as a ghost yesterday, after speaking with you." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I noticed that too." By evening the news had spread. Mr. Pritchard had survived, though confined to bed on the doctor's orders. Miss Marple, under the pretext of delivering a jar of broth, called the next morning. The postmaster's small house smelled faintly of ink and tobacco, the remnants of a life lived among letters and secrets. He was propped up with pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. "You've come to scold me, I suppose?" he rasped when he saw her. "About that letter." "Scold you? My dear Mr. Pritchard, I came to wish you well." She placed the jar carefully on the table beside his bed. "But since you mention it, I was wondering how such an old letter came to be found behind your office. It must have lain there for years, unless someone wished it to be found." He looked away, his hands fidgeting with the blanket. I didn't mean to keep it. When Mrs. Chilcot's letter came through all those years ago, I knew it wasn't meant to be seen. Her husband, he was a proud man, and she was frightened." "Frightened?" He nodded faintly. "She told me once after his death. Said Edward had been acting strange, accusing her of things that weren't true. Thought she'd betrayed him with that friend of hers from London, Mr. Hammond, I think the name was. Nonsense, of course. But Edward was unstable. She feared what he might do." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind was already fitting the new information into place. "So when he died, suddenly, his heart, they said, she was relieved?" "Relieved and ashamed," Pritchard murmured. "But it wasn't her doing, I swear. She told me that herself. Only she never could bear to destroy that letter. Said it was her punishment to keep it." He shifted, eyes darting toward the door. "You don't think her death was because of that, do you?" Miss Marple hesitated a moment before answering. "I think, Mr. Pritchard, that what frightens us most rarely stays buried. Someone else knew of that letter, and of what it contained, or perhaps of what it suggested. And fear, you know, is often the truest motive for murder. When she left the house, the village seemed quieter than usual, as though holding its breath. Across the green, she could see Inspector Crail speaking with Dr. Haydock near the constable's bicycle. As she approached, Crail's expression was grim. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. You've heard, no doubt. Pritchard's alive, but only just. The doctor says shock, though I'd call it a guilty conscience." "Not guilt, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "Fear again, I think. He's told me what little he knows, and I dare say you'll find Mr. Hammond's name worth revisiting. He was once a friend to the Chilcotts before Edward's death." Crail frowned. "Hammond? Yes, I've seen the name. Lived in London then, now retired somewhere near Market Basing. You think he's involved?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that we mustn't assume murder begins in the present. It often starts years before, in some small act of deceit that seemed harmless at the time." She turned slightly, gazing across the misty churchyard, where the lilacs swayed faintly in the wind. "You see, Inspector, Mrs. Chilcott wasn't killed for what she did 20 years ago. She was killed for what she remembered." That evening, as the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, eyes on the path leading from the post office. Somewhere out there, the murderer was waiting. Someone who had read that hidden letter. Someone whose peace depended upon silence. She reached for her knitting, her needles gleaming faintly in the lamplight, and murmured to herself, "When people hide their sins, they often choose the nearest hiding place, and sometimes—" She glanced toward the window where the rain had begun again. "It's not the dead who keep the secret, but the one who helped them bury it." The following day brought a faint, chill sunlight, the kind that never quite reached warmth. St. Mary Mead awoke subdued but restless, the air thick with speculation disguised as sympathy. Mrs. Price Finch was already at the grocer's, declaring that Mrs. Chilcott's death must have been divine retribution, while young Peter Ellison had not been seen since the night before, a fact that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Inspector Crail arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, his hat still damp from the morning mist. He looked tired, the kind of weariness that comes from chasing too many threads and finding each one knotted. "You were right about that name, Hammond," he said without preamble. "Retired barrister. Corresponded with Mrs. Chilcott up until about 6 months ago. Says she wrote to him about something she'd found, something she thought would set her free at last." He assumed it was spiritual nonsense. Miss Marple poured him tea, her expression thoughtful. "People often mistake guilt for faith, Inspector. It comforts them to call their fear a matter of conscience." Crail accepted the cup, but remained standing, restless. "There's more. The doctor found traces of bruising on the widow's wrist, older than the head wound, at least a day old, as though someone had grabbed her hard. The maid swears no one visited that morning." Miss Marple stirred her tea absently. No one she noticed, perhaps. Servants rarely see what happens just beyond their duties, and Mrs. Chilcott was not one to entertain guests openly. "Tell me, did the maid mention anything unusual that day?" Crail glanced at his notebook. "Only that her mistress received a small parcel the morning of the fete. No return address. She put it away in her writing desk before leaving for the event. We've checked, the parcel's gone." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. A parcel without sender, a letter addressed to be read only after my death, and a box buried beneath daffodils. Such curious symmetry, don't you think? Almost as if the past were packaging itself neatly to be reopened. Crail gave her a long, wary look. "You think whoever sent that parcel killed her?" "Oh, not at once," Miss Marple said softly. "Guilt is rarely punctual, but something in that parcel, perhaps a letter, perhaps an object, reminded her of a secret she'd kept too long. And secrets, like flowers, eventually force their way to the surface." The inspector left soon after, muttering about London inquiries and old correspondences. When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple sat for a moment, motionless, her fingers lightly resting on the teacup. Her eyes, however, were bright with purpose. An hour later, she was standing once again in the late Mrs. Chilcott's drawing room. The maid, still pale and hollow-eyed, admitted her without question. "The inspector's men have already been through everything," she said nervously. "Said there was nothing more to find." "Oh, I shouldn't think so," Miss Marple replied kindly, moving toward the writing desk. Men so rarely look in the places women hide their feelings. She opened the desk drawers carefully. The top one contained a neat row of correspondence, the kind of orderly domestic archive that revealed more by omission than by presence. Receipts, invitations, holiday cards, all banal. But beneath them, at the very back, she found a folded sheet of notepaper. It was a draft, written in a trembling hand, unmistakably belonging to Mrs. Chilcott. "To my dear Peter, if ever you read this, you must understand that I never wished you to suffer for my sins. You have been loyal beyond measure, and I cannot bear the thought of what you might discover. There was never a crime, only a mistake, though it has followed me all my life. Forgive me for what I must do tonight. It will be better this way." Miss Marple read the words twice, her lips pressing together in quiet thought. Then she replaced the paper exactly where she had found it and turned to the maid, who was watching anxiously from the doorway. "Tell me, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, "was young Mr. Ellison here the night before the fete?" The maid hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window. I wasn't supposed to say. He came late after dark," they argued, quiet-like but fierce. "I heard her say, 'I won't protect you any longer,' and he said, 'Then you'll ruin everything.' He left soon after." She was crying. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if confirming a thought she had already half-formed. "And she received the parcel the next morning," she murmured. Yes, that would fit rather neatly, wouldn't it?" She thanked the girl, then walked out into the pale afternoon light. The church bells were chiming 11, their sound heavy in the damp air. Across the green, the post office curtains twitched again, though the postmaster's house now stood silent. Miss Marple paused by the gate, looking toward the churchyard where the sundial caught what little light broke through the clouds. "2 deaths," she whispered, "separated by 20 years, bound by the same fear. Poor Edward Chilcott. He did not die of his heart at all, did he? And she knew it. She lived with that knowledge until someone decided she'd lived long enough." Her gaze lingered on the distant shape of the mill lane where Peter Ellison's cottage stood half-hidden among the willows. A faint wind stirred the lilacs, carrying, with it, the scent of earth newly turned. She smiled sadly. "Murder," she said under her breath, "is such a very domestic thing, when you come to think of it." And with that, she began walking toward the lane where the first true answers, she knew, were waiting to show themselves. The lane was quiet, save for the soft murmur of the stream that wound its way behind the cottages. Miss Marple's sensible shoes made almost no sound as she walked, her eyes absorbing every detail. The faint scuff of boots on the damp earth, the fresh sawdust at the edge of the fence, the faint wisp of chimney smoke curling from Peter Ellison's cottage. The garden gate was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. It had not been properly latched. When she knocked, no answer came. Miss Marple waited, then knocked again, louder this time. From within came the sound of hurried movement, something set down hastily, a floorboard creaking. A long pause followed, then the door opened a few inches. Peter stood there, pale and unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry. I didn't expect visitors." "I dare say not," she replied mildly. "It's a difficult week for everyone, I imagine. But I thought I might offer a few kind words. Mrs. Chilcott was very fond of you, you know." He blinked, his throat working as though swallowing something bitter. "Was she? Well, I suppose she was. She helped me when I first came to the village. My parents were gone, and she said she wanted to make things right. Miss Marple nodded, glancing subtly around the little room as he stepped aside to let her in. It was neat enough, though there was an air of recent disturbance, papers stacked too quickly, a chair slightly askew, and on the table, a small parcel-sized indentation in the dust. "You've been sorting things, Mr. Ellison?" she asked gently, her eyes never leaving his. He hesitated. "Just clearing space. I can't think properly when it's messy." "Quite understandable," she said. "Order has a way of calming the mind, doesn't it? Though sometimes, of course, it conceals disorder rather neatly." He gave a short, uneasy laugh, unsure whether she was joking. She smiled pleasantly, her hands folded in front of her. "I've just come from Mrs. Chilcott's house," she said after a pause. "Such a sad business. They say she received a parcel on the morning of the fete. You didn't happen to see the post that day, did you? The postman's route often passes your cottage first." Peter looked startled. No, I didn't see him. I was in the woods most of the morning cutting branches." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," said Miss Marple lightly. "Only the postmaster's wife insists there were 2 parcels on his list that morning. One for Mrs. Chilcott, and another that seems to have vanished entirely. Curious, don't you think?" He froze, then forced another brittle smile. "Well, mistakes happen. I'm sure it's nothing." Miss Marple regarded him with an expression of gentle sympathy that masked a deep, unrelenting scrutiny. "Indeed. But I do wonder whether Mrs. Chilcott might have opened hers before the fete. Such a pity if she hadn't time to read what it contained. Letters can change everything, you know, especially if they remind us of something unpleasant." For a moment, his composure cracked. A faint tremor passed through his hands, quickly hidden as he gripped the back of a chair. "She shouldn't have gone digging," he said under his breath. "It was over, all of it, she promised." Miss Marple said nothing. Silence, she knew, was often the most persuasive form of inquiry. After a moment, Peter seemed to realize what he'd said and shook his head violently. "I mean, she was always bringing up the past. You know how old people can be. Making mountains out of old mistakes." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Only sometimes, dear boy, those old mistakes are not quite so harmless as they appear." She rose then, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for the tea. You've been very patient with an old woman's chatter. Oh, one last thing. The Easter letter. You wouldn't happen to know what that was about?" His eyes darted to her, and for a fraction of a second, fear flickered there. Raw, unmistakable. "The Easter letter," he repeated. "No, I don't know anything about it." Miss Marple smiled as though satisfied, but as she turned to leave, she noted the faint scent that lingered in the room, the acrid tang of burnt paper. She glanced once more toward the hearth, where a few grey flakes of ash clung to the grate. Outside, the sky had darkened. She walked back toward the village green slowly, her mind working in its quiet, relentless rhythm. The tone of Peter's voice, the mention of promises, the missing parcel, the draft of a farewell letter, all threads weaving into something far more intricate than mere guilt or sentiment. When she reached her garden gate, she saw Inspector Crail waiting once more, hat in hand, his expression grim. "We've just found something odd," he said. "Behind the vicarage, a man's pocket watch buried under the hedgerow, engraved with the initials E.C. Miss Marple's eyes lit with a soft, sad recognition. "Edward Chilcott," she murmured. "At last, he surfaces." Then, more quietly, as though to herself, "And if I am not mistaken, the one who buried him also buried his truth." She looked toward the lane where the smoke from Peter's chimney had faded entirely and said, "Inspector, I think it's time we asked young Mr. Ellison not what he remembers, but what he's been trying so hard to forget." Inspector Crail frowned, his breath misting faintly in the cool air. You think that watch means something, Miss Marple? Could have been dropped years ago. These gardens are full of odds and ends. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the clouds rolled low over the church steeple. Dropped, perhaps, but buried, she said softly. That speaks of intention, not accident. And intention, Inspector, is where murder begins. He rubbed his chin, uncertain. I suppose you think the boy did it, Peter Ellison. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think poor Peter has lived in a house filled with ghosts. Whether one of them wears the face of guilt or of fear remains to be seen. The inspector grunted, unconvinced but curious enough to follow her lead. They made their way back toward the Chilcot house as the first drops of rain began to fall, a thin drizzle that softened the outlines of everything, the cottages, the hedges, even the sorrow clinging to the little village. The maid opened the door nervously, her eyes flicking between them. Has anyone been here since I left earlier? Miss Marple asked gently. The maid shook her head. No, ma'am. Only Reverend Weatherby. He came to say a prayer over the room. He said it might ease the spirit. Miss Marple's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. How kind of him. He and Mrs. Chilcot were close, were they not? Oh, yes, the maid said quickly. She saw him nearly every week, sometimes twice. She said he was the only man she trusted. The inspector gave a small snort. Seems half the parish thought the same. Miss Marple ignored the remark. She moved quietly through the sitting room, her eyes following the faint trail of damp footprints the maid had made earlier. They stopped near the writing desk, the same spot where the missing parcel had last been seen. The faintest scent of lavender lingered there, oddly out of place amid the usual mustiness of old wood and polish. Inspector, she said softly, may I trouble you to ask Reverend Weatherby to join us here this afternoon? There are one or two matters he might help us clarify. He looked wary. Do you suspect him? I suspect, she said gently, that in a village such as this, everyone knows more than they admit, the Reverend most of all. Crail sighed, but sent one of his constables to fetch the vicar. While they waited, Miss Marple wandered toward the mantelpiece where a single photograph stood, a younger Mrs. Chilcot beside a man in uniform. The man's face was open, almost boyish, but his eyes carried that faintly distracted look of one accustomed to secrets. The back of the frame bore a date, faintly written, Easter, 1916. Miss Marple's fingers lingered there a moment before she set the frame down. The maid's words echoed faintly. The Easter letter. It was not the first one then, but the last in a line of correspondence that had begun long before. The door creaked, and Reverend Weatherby entered, a tall, spare man with thinning hair and an air of quiet authority. He inclined his head respectfully. Inspector, Miss Marple, this is a dreadful business. I was just preparing my sermon when your man called. I'm sorry to trouble you, Reverend, Miss Marple said pleasantly. But you see, we've been trying to understand something. You were close to Mrs. Chilcot, were you not? He nodded gravely. She was a troubled soul. Confession gave her peace, or so I hoped. Did she ever speak of her late husband? The vicar's gaze flickered briefly, then steadied. Yes, often. She felt she'd failed him in some way, that his death was not what it should have been. I told her that guilt can linger even in the innocent. Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. Did she ever mention writing him letters after his death? That earned a visible reaction. How could she? He's been gone for 20 years. Grief does strange things, Reverend. She was found clutching one such letter, written in her own hand, addressed to be read after her death. The Reverend's composure faltered. I didn't know, he murmured. Of course, Miss Marple said kindly. And yet I do wonder if you were the one she turned to when she realized what that parcel contained. His head jerked up. Parcel? A small one, she said softly. Delivered on the morning of the fete. No sender, no message. Just an unwelcome reminder. She put it away in her desk, you see. Later it vanished. I dare say you'd know what was in it if you happened to see her that morning." The silence stretched. The ticking of the mantel clock filled the room. At last, Weatherby sighed, shoulders drooping. "I went to see her, yes. She'd received something that distressed her. She said it proved everything she feared about Edward's death was true, that it hadn't been an accident at all. I told her to destroy it, for her own peace of mind." "But she didn't," Miss Marple murmured. "She hid it instead, hoping no one would find it. A guilty act, or perhaps a frightened one." Crail leaned forward. "And what was it, Reverend? What did the parcel contain?" Weatherby's voice dropped to a whisper. "A photograph. Edward Chilcot and a woman I didn't recognize. On the back, the words, 'Your sin lives on.'" Miss Marple inhaled quietly, her gaze fixed on the vicar. "And that woman, if you had to guess, Reverend, might she have been someone still living in this village?" The Reverend hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I cannot be sure," he said finally. "But it could have been Mrs. Harcourt. She was Edward's cousin, or so she said." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Inspector Crail, whose eyes widened slightly. "Mrs. Harcourt," he muttered, "the one who was at the fete that day. She left early, claiming a headache." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, almost to herself, "and now she has every reason to pray that headache will not return, because I believe she's been nursing it for 20 years. Outside, the rain fell, harder, drumming softly against the window panes. Within the quiet of the drawing room, a deeper tension took root, the sense that the past, so long buried, had at last begun to stir. Miss Marple and Inspector Crail walked together beneath the dripping eaves of the vicarage porch, the air thick with rain and quiet thought. The inspector lit a cigarette with damp fingers, his face set in a grim frown. "So now we've a new name," he muttered. "Mrs. Harcourt, the cousin. I've half a mind to bring her in straight away." Miss Marple's tone was calm, almost placid. "Oh, I shouldn't advise that, Inspector. Mrs. Harcourt has the stubborn pride of a woman who's been hiding something far too long. She would never confess under pressure. No, we must let her speak freely and believe she's still safe." Crail gave her a sidelong look. "You mean to bait her?" "Not bait," said Miss Marple gently. "Merely present her with the right company. People say the most revealing things when they believe the danger has passed." By the time they reached Mrs. Harcourt's cottage, the rain had eased into a fine mist. The small house stood near the edge of the green, its windows gleaming faintly in the dim light. Miss Marple noticed the curtains drawn tighter than usual. A little too quickly, perhaps, when they'd been seen approaching. Mrs. Harcourt opened the door herself. She was a woman of about 50, elegant in a deliberate, almost theatrical way, her silver hair immaculately pinned, her expression the polished mask of one accustomed to scrutiny. "Inspector Crail, Miss Marple," she said coolly. "I assume this is about poor Margaret. Such a ghastly thing, really. Do come in." Her voice held the faint tremor of one performing calm rather than feeling it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilac and smoke, perhaps from a fire just recently extinguished. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the hearth before taking a seat. Crail wasted no time. "Mrs. Harcourt, we understand you were close to Mrs. Chilcot and her late husband." Her smile did not waver. "Oh, everyone was close to Edward. He was charming to a fault. Margaret knew that, though she never liked to admit it." "You were cousins, were you not?" "So the family said," she replied lightly, though her tone thinned around the edges. "A distant connection. We saw a good deal of one another during the war years." Miss Marple's voice came soft as a feather. "You must have been quite fond of him." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flicked toward her. "Fond? Hardly. Edward was difficult. He liked attention. I was young, foolish perhaps, and Margaret was already suspicious. It made for unpleasantness all around." Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. I can imagine. And yet, when Margaret received that dreadful photograph, it must have come as a terrible shock to see a past she'd buried so carefully rise to the surface once again. For the first time, Mrs. Harcourt's composure cracked. The color drained slightly from her cheeks. Photograph? She repeated faintly. What photograph? The one sent to her by post, Miss Marple said kindly, as though offering sympathy rather than accusation. The one that showed her husband with a woman and a cruel message on the back. You see, she confided in Reverend Weatherby before she died. A silence settled over the room, fragile and heavy. Mrs. Harcourt's gaze dropped to her folded hands, the diamond on her finger glinting faintly in the firelight. I never sent any photograph, she said at last, but her voice was too flat, too rehearsed. Why would I? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Perhaps to remind her that some debts cannot be forgotten, or perhaps because you feared what she might reveal in that letter she wrote before the fete. At this, Mrs. Harcourt looked up sharply. Letter? What letter? Miss Marple smiled faintly. The one she intended to have opened after her death. I believe she had begun to unburden herself. Perhaps she meant to name not only her husband's sins, but those who helped conceal them. Mrs. Harcourt rose abruptly, pacing toward the mantelpiece. You're suggesting I had something to do with Edward's death, she said, her voice shaking now. That's absurd. He collapsed at home. His heart failed him. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone carried quiet conviction. He collapsed, yes, but only after a quarrel. There were bruises on his wrist, if I recall from the old report. Marks that suggested he was held back as he reached for his medicine. The coroner was lenient, perhaps out of pity for a young widow, but Mrs. Chilcot never forgave herself, and someone else never forgave her either. Mrs. Harcourt stared, her breath quick and shallow. You don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. On the contrary, my dear, I think I do. You see, guilt is rather like mildew. It grows best in the dark. No matter how often one scrubs it away, it always returns. As Miss Marple and the inspector stepped back out into the misty air, Crail muttered, She's hiding something, no doubt of it. But I'll be damned if I can tell whether she sent that parcel or not. Oh, she didn't, Miss Marple said softly. Her hands are too clean and too frightened. The one who sent it wanted her to suffer as much as Mrs. Chilcot. No, Inspector, our murderer isn't the cousin. It's someone who's been watching from much nearer all along. Nearer? Miss Marple glanced toward the churchyard, where a figure moved between the gravestones. Peter Ellison, his head bowed against the rain. Yes, she murmured, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Nearer than any of them suspect, because he's not the son of pity Mrs. Chilcot took in at all. He's the echo of the sin she tried so hard to forget. Crail's eyes widened, realization dawning slowly. But Miss Marple merely smiled her quiet, knowing smile, the rain glinting like glass on her umbrella as she whispered, The past, Inspector, always comes home, especially when it has nowhere else to go. The following morning dawned grey and listless, a thin mist curling low over the village green. St. Mary Mead seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that something unseen had begun to stir beneath its gentle facade. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts already ordered and methodical, her kettle humming softly as she reviewed the threads of the mystery that had tightened around them all. She had not slept well. The image of Peter Ellison standing among the gravestones haunted her. His head bowed, his shoulders bent, not with sorrow, but with something heavier, something coiled. There had been no mention of his parents in any parish records she'd checked, only that he'd arrived one winter, taken in out of kindness by Mrs. Chilcot after a long absence from schooling. A phrase too carefully chosen, she thought. And now, with the old watch unearthed and the echoes of that Easter letter, the truth was edging closer to daylight. Inspector Crail arrived just after 9, his boots muddy from the vicarage path. He looked uneasy. "You were right about Ellison," he said, setting his hat down. "We've checked with the orphanage in Bath. No record of him at all. The papers he gave when he came here were forged. Whoever he is, he's been pretending for years." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes deepened with quiet certainty. "Pretending, yes. But to what end?" "Not money. Mrs. Chilcott's estate is modest. No, I fear what he wanted was older, more personal. Retribution, perhaps." Crail frowned. "For what?" "For his father's death," Miss Marple replied softly. "The father Mrs. Chilcott thought she'd buried with her secret." The inspector stared. "You mean Ellison's her son?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not hers, Inspector. His." She paused delicately. "Edward Chilcott's, the child of that woman in the photograph, Mrs. Harcourt." Crail let out a low whistle. "Good Lord. So he comes back under her roof, pretending gratitude, all the while knowing who she was." "And waiting for the right moment," Miss Marple murmured. "He must have found something among his mother's things. Letters, perhaps, proving what Edward had done. He sent that parcel to torment Mrs. Chilcott, to make her face what she'd concealed. But revenge, Inspector, is an unpredictable companion. It always asks for more than one plans to give." They left together for Ellison's cottage, the morning wind cutting sharp and cold. The door stood ajar when they arrived, and Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside, the fire had burned out, leaving a faint smell of smoke and damp ash. On the table lay a half-burned letter, the writing blackened but still legible in places. Crail bent over it, squinting. "Could not let her live with the lie any longer. Forgive me, Mother." He looked up grimly. "That's his handwriting. But what lie?" Miss Marple's gaze moved to the mantel, where a small photograph rested, one she hadn't noticed before. It showed a young woman with soft features and weary eyes, standing beside a man unmistakably Edward Chilcott. The woman's resemblance to Mrs. Harcourt was faint but undeniable. "The lie," Miss Marple said slowly, "was that Edward's death was accidental. Mrs. Chilcott always feared she'd caused it, but she hadn't. The real cause was buried, and Peter unearthed it." Footsteps sounded suddenly outside. Peter appeared in the doorway, pale and hollow-eyed, rain dripping from his coat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "You needn't run, my dear boy. Running won't make the past any less cruel." He froze, his breath shallow. "You don't understand. She killed him. My father. She poisoned him. And then she made the village believe it was his heart. I had to make her see. Had to make her remember what she did." Crail stepped forward. "You sent the parcel?" Peter's gaze darted between them, the defiance flickering in his eyes before it collapsed into despair. "Yes. I found the letters my mother kept hidden. He promised her he'd leave his wife, but he never did. She died of fever while he was at home with the woman who ruined her. I wanted Mrs. Chilcott to feel that guilt again. I never meant to kill her." Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "But you confronted her, didn't you? She told you the truth, that your father's heart failed him after an argument. You didn't believe her. You pushed her, perhaps only to frighten her, and she fell." Peter's face crumpled, the fight draining from him. "She fell," he whispered. "I didn't mean to. She just fell." Crail took his arm firmly, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the young man's bowed head, her heart heavy. "Revenge," she said quietly, "is never satisfied with just one death. It takes what little innocence remains and leaves only ashes behind." Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, as though the village itself were washing its conscience clean. Miss Marple stood at the gate as Peter was led away, the mist curling around them like memory. She did not watch long. Her thoughts were already elsewhere, on the fragile lives of those who carried secrets too long, and how easily love, guilt, and vengeance could weave themselves into tragedy. When she returned home that evening, she placed fresh flowers in the small vase by her window. As the clock chimed 6, she sat down with her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles steadying the quiet. "Poor boy," she murmured, "and poor Margaret. Both prisoners of the same sin, though neither knew it." Then, after a long pause, she added softly, "One should never underestimate how far the past will go to be remembered." For several days after Peter's arrest, St. Mary Mead moved under a hush so complete that even the birds seemed reluctant to disturb it. Word spread, of course. It always did, but with a peculiar reverence, as though speaking too loudly of what had happened might draw the past back into the present. Miss Marple, meanwhile, kept to her routine, though her thoughts remained fixed on the single question that still troubled her. If Mrs. Chilcott's death had truly been an accident, why had there been traces of laudanum found in her teacup? The coroner had ruled it inconclusive. Too little to suggest poisoning, yet too much to ignore. Crail believed Peter had meant to frighten her and gone too far, but Miss Marple's intuition whispered otherwise. Something did not fit. The boy's remorse had been genuine, his confusion too real to fake. He had not known about the laudanum. Someone else had been in that house before the fall. Late one afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage to return a book she had borrowed, but it was not the vicar she sought. Mrs. Haycroft, the housekeeper, was polishing the brass candlesticks, her chatter brisk as ever. Between remarks about the dreadful weather and the state of the parish linens, she mentioned something that made Miss Marple still her hands. "Funny, isn't it, how Mrs. Chilcott had that visitor last week? I thought she'd given up receiving folk, but there was a gentleman, tall, with a limp. Came in a motor car and left before tea." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "A limp, you say?" Mrs. Haycroft nodded. "Oh, yes. Said he was from the solicitor's office in Bath. I only saw him from the lane, but he looked a bit too young for a lawyer, if you ask me." That evening, Miss Marple retrieved the newspaper Peter had used to wrap the burned letter she'd found. The date, 3 days before Mrs. Chilcott's death. She took her magnifying glass and studied the advertisement on the edge of the paper. "For sale, 1923 Austin, one owner, Bath. Inquire, R. Harcourt." The surname struck her like a bell. Harcourt, the same as Peter's mother. Could it be coincidence? Or had someone used that name deliberately, knowing it would stir the past? She resolved to visit the solicitor's office herself. The next morning, under the pretense of managing a small inheritance for the church bazaar, Miss Marple arrived at the office on Pulteney Street. The clerk, a young man with round spectacles, confirmed her suspicion almost immediately. "We've had no one by that name, madam, nor do we employ anyone with a limp. But we did receive an inquiry last week from a man asking after the Chilcott estate. Gave no name, only said he was tracing heirs." "Tracing heirs?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "And did he leave an address?" The clerk shook his head. "Only that he'd return, but he hasn't yet." When she returned to St. Mary Mead, the dusk was gathering, the air heavy with the promise of rain. She crossed the green slowly, her eyes lifting toward the church tower where the bell rope swayed faintly in the wind. If this mysterious visitor had come not from the solicitor but with another purpose, perhaps to blackmail, perhaps to silence, then Peter's tragedy might not have been the only crime committed that night. She reached her cottage, lit the lamp, and sat before the window. The rain began to fall in a soft, steady rhythm. There was something about the limp, the name, the timing. It all pointed to a design too deliberate to ignore. Mrs. Chilcott's fear, the strange look in her eyes days before her death, now returned to her with dreadful clarity. Miss Marple folded her hands, her mind turning over every detail with quiet precision. Someone else was in that house, she murmured. Someone who knew both Margaret and Edward Chilcot, and who knew exactly what that name would mean. At that moment, the faint creak of a gate sounded outside. She looked up. Through the rain-streaked glass, a shadow moved along the path toward her door, a tall figure, walking with the unmistakable, uneven rhythm of a man with a limp. Miss Marple did not rise at once. Instead, she remained perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded neatly on her lap, the lamplight casting a steady glow upon her calm, watchful face. The sound of footsteps approached the door, measured, uneven, deliberate. Then a pause. A faint cough, as though the visitor were testing whether anyone was inside. Only when the knock came, 3 slow raps, did Miss Marple stir. She adjusted her shawl, smoothed her skirt, and opened the door just enough to reveal her visitor. A man stood before her, soaked from the rains, his hat pulled low. The lamplight caught the hard lines of his face. Mid-40s, perhaps, though rough living had worn him older. The limp was unmistakable. Each movement carried the weight of an old injury. "Good evening," Miss Marple said pleasantly, as though greeting a stranger lost in the storm. "You must have had a dreadful walk in this weather. Won't you come in?" He hesitated before stepping inside, glancing about the small sitting room with a wariness that did not escape her notice. "I hope I'm not intruding. The innkeeper at the Hare and Hound said you might know something about Mrs. Chilcot." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, closing the door softly. "A sad business, but we do what we can to keep our hearts charitable in times of tragedy. May I ask your name?" He removed his hat, wringing the brim. "Raymond Harcourt. I believe you've heard of me." Miss Marple's eyes, pale and unassuming, flickered only once. "Ah, so you are the gentleman from Bath. Or near enough, I imagine." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "I'm not from Bath, and I've nothing to do with that woman's death. I came only for what was mine." Miss Marple gestured delicately toward the chair opposite her. "Then perhaps you'll tell me what that was." He sank into the chair, the old wound in his leg making him wince. "Margaret Chilcot, she was my half-sister. Same father, different mothers. He left something to me once, a small inheritance, but it was supposed to be passed through her if I couldn't be found. She never meant to give it, I expect. Thought me a scoundrel." "And were you?" Miss Marple asked gently. He gave a hollow laugh. "Once, perhaps. Prison cures a man of a great deal of vanity. I only wanted the letter. She said she'd kept it. My father's will, written before he took ill. I came to ask for it, but she wouldn't see me." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze kind yet piercing. "You came that week. The vicar's housekeeper saw you from the lane. You left before tea." Harcourt's jaw tightened. "I waited for her to change her mind. I saw her son, Peter is it? He told me to leave her alone. A proud boy, that one. And when she died, I was long gone by then. I didn't even know until I read the paper. But someone found the letter, didn't they?" His eyes darted toward her mantelpiece, where the faint outline of an envelope lay beneath a porcelain vase. "You've always been clever, Miss Marple. They say you notice what others miss." Miss Marple said nothing. The rain beat harder against the window. She rose, moved to the vase, and took out the letter. It was brittle, the ink smudged with age, but the seal, a faint red wax mark, remained intact. She placed it on the table between them. "This is what she hid," she said softly, "and what she feared would destroy her peace. But I'm afraid, Mr. Harcourt, it holds no riches, only the truth." He stared at it, his eyes dark with confusion. "The truth?" "Yes, that your father did not leave you an inheritance, only an apology. He wrote that he had wronged your mother and regretted abandoning you both. Mrs. Chilcot was to ensure you were told, but she feared it would reopen old wounds." Harcourt's shoulders sagged. The fight drained from him like air, leaving a punctured tire. "All that time, All that anger. Miss Marple watched him quietly. Grievances fester, Mr. Harcourt. They twist into something else if left too long unattended. Mrs. Chilcot thought silence was kindness, but secrets, I'm afraid, rarely stay buried. He rose unsteadily, his expression hollow. You'll tell them I wasn't there that night. I already have, she replied. Inspector Crail may be slow, but not heartless. He'll want to know about your visit, though. I should advise you tell him yourself before he hears it elsewhere. Harcourt nodded once, then turned toward the door. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle, silver in the lamplight. He stepped into it without looking back. Miss Marple remained standing for a long while after he'd gone. Then she sat again, the letter still on the table, and folded her hands over it. Somewhere in the village, a clock struck 10. Justice, she thought, came in many forms, but seldom without sorrow. Outside, the rain stopped altogether, leaving the garden wrapped in silence. And in that stillness, Miss Marple finally allowed herself a quiet sigh, for she knew that even in a place as gentle as St. Mary Mead, forgiveness was the hardest truth of all. The next morning dawned pale and cool, with a faint mist hanging over the hedgerows. St. Mary Mead seemed almost to hold its breath, as though the village, sensing that something unseen had settled at last, dared not stir too soon. Miss Marple, however, was already awake. She sat at her breakfast table, the letter now folded neatly beside her teacup, and her mind, though calm, was quietly alert. She had expected Inspector Crail to arrive early, and indeed, by the time she finished her second cup of tea, the sound of his motor car broke the stillness outside. He entered with his usual briskness, hat in hand, his face composed but tired. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, setting his hat on the rack. "I've had an interesting conversation with a Mr. Raymond Harcourt. Came to the station first thing, said he'd been advised to tell his story to me. By you, I gather." "I did suggest it," she replied mildly. "It seemed the decent thing. He's not the man you're looking for, I take it?" Crail shook his head. "No, I don't think so. Poor devil's been half-starved and looks as though life's done its worst already. But his tale fills in certain gaps. Mrs. Chilcot must have been quite beside herself when he appeared. There's mention in her diary, well, in a fragment of it, that someone from her past had returned. She wrote only one word beside the date: unforgiven." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Ah, how very telling." Crail sighed, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. "Still, it doesn't change the main business. The coroner's report came this morning. The laudanum was taken some time before the fall. Too much to be accidental. But the glass, you see, bore no fingerprints but hers. That rules out our young Peter entirely." Miss Marple nodded slowly, unless she was persuaded to take it by someone she trusted. He frowned. "Meaning?" "She was a widow, Inspector. Lonely, perhaps. And loneliness can make a woman vulnerable to influence, especially when cloaked in friendship. Have you spoken again with Mrs. Haycroft?" "The vicar's housekeeper?" "No, why should I?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because she has an interest in everyone's troubles and a tongue too ready for comfort. She often visited Mrs. Chilcot, you know. I've wondered whether her kindness might not have been overly sympathetic." Crail blinked. "You think she—" Miss Marple held up a hand gently. "No accusations, but I've learned that poison, in whatever form it takes, seldom comes from hatred alone. It often comes from pity. Misguided pity." Crail looked at her for a long moment, then rose abruptly. "I'll see to it, though I can't imagine that kindly old soul doing harm to anyone." "Few can," Miss Marple said softly, returning her gaze to her untouched toast. By afternoon, the village was humming again with quiet speculation. The gossip that had briefly settled now rose anew. Mrs. Haycroft had been taken to the station for questioning. It seemed, as Miss Marple later learned, that a small bottle had been found among her things, labelled cough mixture, but the contents, when tested, matched the laudanum from Mrs. Chilcott's tea. When Miss Marple visited her that evening, Mrs. Haycroft sat in the vicar's study, her hands trembling as she twisted a handkerchief. She looked up, her eyes rimmed red. "I didn't mean for her to die, Miss Marple. Truly I didn't. She said she couldn't sleep, that her heart was troubled. I gave her only a spoonful, so she might rest. I never thought she'd take more." Miss Marple's expression was grave but not unkind. "And yet you must have known she was agitated, that she'd been visited by someone she feared." Mrs. Haycroft began to weep softly. "She begged me not to tell anyone, said she'd done something wicked years ago, something that ruined a good man. I thought she was raving, poor soul. I only wanted to ease her mind." Miss Marple reached across the table, resting her hand gently on the woman's sleeve. "You wish to help her, and that is no small mercy. But mercy, dear Mrs. Haycroft, can sometimes be cruel when it spares the truth." When she left the vicarage, the air was cool and clear once more. The mist had lifted entirely, revealing a faint blush of evening light over the downs. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts were not of guilt or innocence, but of frailty, the quiet, trembling line between comfort and deceit. Later, as she sat once more by her window, knitting beside the fading fire, she heard the church clock strike 8. The village would sleep peacefully again now, though its heart was marked by what had passed. And Miss Marple, with her eyes half closed, thought how very much like life itself such mysteries were. Gentle on the surface, yet hiding beneath all that calm the steady pulse of sorrow and the quiet, unfailing wisdom of human nature. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, the first truly warm day of spring. The village green was once again alive with its ordinary rhythm, children darting after hoops, gardeners tending to their plots, and the faint chime of the church bell calling the faithful to morning service. St. Mary Mead, as always, healed itself quietly, covering its scars with politeness and tea. Miss Marple sat in her garden with a small pot of Darjeeling and a plate of currant buns, her knitting needles resting idly in her lap. From her chair beneath the lilac bush, she could see nearly all of the green. People passed her gate now and then, offering polite nods and murmured greetings, but no one mentioned the Chilcott affair aloud. Such things, once properly tidied up by the law, were best left unspoken. Inspector Crail arrived just after 11, his hat tilted back, his face softer than it had been in weeks. "You'll be pleased to know," he began, taking the seat she indicated, "that Mrs. Haycroft has been released. The magistrate ruled it accidental, no intent to harm. She'll go to her sister in Bath for a while, poor woman." "I'm glad of that," Miss Marple said, pouring him a cup. "She meant no evil. She only tried, in her way, to soothe a conscience already too burdened." Crail nodded. "We've closed the case officially. No more suspects, no more questions. But I'll admit, I still don't see how you knew it wasn't the boy. Everyone else was certain." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on the steam rising from her teacup. "It was all quite simple, really. Mrs. Chilcott's tea tray told the story. The cup with laudanum was placed on the small table near her chair, not the one by the window where Peter said he'd been standing. A mother's instinct, she wouldn't have left her son's tea within reach of poison. And Peter, poor child, was too distraught afterward to have tampered with it, but Mrs. Haycroft, she always brought the tray, and she meant only to calm her. 'Laudanum for nerves,' she said. 'It was an act of pity, not of murder.'" Crail considered this in silence, the wind stirring the lilacs beside them. "And the letter?" he asked at last. "You never did tell me what it said." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church tower, its spire glinting in the noon sun. It was not an inheritance, as Mr. Harcourt believed. It was a confession, a father's sorrow and a sister's shame. The widow hid it all her life because truth is a hard companion, Inspector. When Mr. Harcourt came back, she feared the past had found her, Fear, as I have often observed, makes fools of the best of us. Crail let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. You make it sound like a moral, Miss Marple. It usually is, she said with a small smile. People are rarely wicked for sport, you know. They do wrong out of love, or pride, or fear. The world would be simpler if evil wore a darker face. But it so often looks like kindness. The inspector rose after a moment, taking his hat. You've a way of making a man feel both wiser and more foolish at the same time. Miss Marple chuckled softly. A useful balance, I should think. When he left, she remained in the garden, listening to the hum of bees and the distant chatter of children near the pond. Her eyes, though lined with age, were bright and steady. Another small tragedy had been laid to rest, another human tangle quietly undone. She reached for her knitting again, her fingers nimble despite the years, and murmured to herself, Easter always does reveal what was hidden. Letters, truths, hearts. It's a season made for resurrection. And as the church bells began to ring across the village, their sound clear and forgiving in the mild spring air, Miss Marple smiled to herself, gentle, wise, and utterly serene. The mystery was over, and life, as it always did in St. Mary Mead, went quietly on.